Life was quiet in the small town of Liberty, Missouri, in 2018. The town of about 30,000 people was a typical American suburb. Neat houses, a local bar where people gathered in the evenings, and an auto parts factory that provided jobs for half the residents. Among the factory workers was 38-year-old welder Daniel Crow, a man described by his colleagues as quiet but reliable. Daniel lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of the city, his days spent between shifts at the factory and the occasional drink with friends. He was unmarried, had no children, and, according to those who knew him, rarely talked about his personal life. In the same town lived 50-year-old Margaret Lindsay, a receptionist at a local dental clinic. Margaret was divorced. Her 2 adult children lived in other states. She was known in Liberty as a sociable woman, always well-groomed, with a bright smile. She was often seen at local events, be it a charity evening or a fair. Margaret loved to dance and often visited the bar, Old Brewery, which served inexpensive beer and played live music. Their paths crossed in June 2018 at this very bar. Daniel, who usually kept to himself, found himself at the same table with Margaret after a mutual friend introduced them. The conversation began with banal topics: work, the weather, news of the city. Margaret, accustomed to light flirting, noticed that Daniel, despite his reserve, listened attentively and occasionally smiled. That evening, they exchanged phone numbers. A week later, Daniel called. Their first date was at a cafe on Liberty's Main Street. Margaret ordered coffee and pie. Daniel ordered black tea. They talked about life in the city, how Margaret dreamed of traveling, and Daniel admitted that he had never left Missouri. The meetings became regular. By August 2018, their relationship had reached a new level. Margaret began staying overnight at Daniel's, and he occasionally showed up at her apartment downtown. Margaret's co-workers noticed that she began to smile more often and talk about her new friend. Daniel, on the other hand, remained silent, but his boss noticed that he began to take more overtime, as if he wanted to save money. No one at Liberty suspected that this romance, which began so casually, would lead to tragedy. By the fall of 2018, Daniel Crow and Margaret Lindsay's relationship had become the talk of Liberty. Locals, accustomed to knowing everything about each other, noticed the couple spending time together. They were seen in cafes, on walks by the river, or at the old brew house. However, despite the outward idol, Daniel remained a mystery even to those who had known him for years. His reserve, which had previously seemed like just a character trait, began to raise questions among some of his acquaintances. Daniel Crow was born in Liberty and lived there all his life. He graduated from the local school, where he did not stand out either for success or problems. After graduating in 1998, he entered a technical college, but dropped out after a year and went to work at a factory. Welding became his profession, and he was good at it, precise, accurate, never late. His colleagues respected him, but Daniel did not have close friends. His life outside of work was almost invisible. He did not use social networks, did not go to city festivals, and rarely talked about the past. However, Daniel had his own secrets. In 2010, he was arrested for marijuana possession, but the case ended with a fine and probation. Few people knew about this episode, as Daniel avoided discussions. In addition, his neighbor, an elderly man named Roy, once mentioned that he saw Daniel digging a hole in his yard late at night. Roy decided that it was related to plumbing repairs and did not pay attention to it. But later, when the police began asking questions, this incident came up in conversations. Daniel's behavior with Margaret was also ambiguous. He was attentive. He brought her flowers, fixed minor problems in her apartment, drove her to the neighboring city for shopping in his old pickup. But Margaret sometimes complained to her friends that Daniel avoided talking about the future. When she suggested moving in together or planning a vacation together, he changed the subject or joked about it. Margaret's friends believed that he was simply not ready for a serious relationship, but this did not stop her. She saw in Daniel the reliability and calmness that she lacked in her previous marriage. Meanwhile, at the plant, Daniel began to act differently. He began taking more days off, although he had previously worked without breaks. His supervisor noticed that Daniel sometimes seemed distracted, and once caught him talking on the phone in the locker room. Daniel quickly ended the call, but seemed anxious. No one knew who he was talking to, but police later discovered that during this period he had been frequently calling a number registered to a person in Kansas City, not associated with Liberty. Margaret Lindsay was well known in Liberty. Her open nature and active participation in the life of the city made her a noticeable figure. She had been working as a receptionist at the dental clinic for 15 years, and patients appreciated her for her kindness. Margaret was always dressed tastefully, took care of herself, and looked younger than her 50 years. However, behind her smile there was a difficult story that only close friends and relatives knew about. Margaret was born in 1968 in Kansas City to a middle-class family. She married a school teacher named Paul Lindsay at age 22. The marriage, initially happy, produced 2 children, a daughter, Emily, and a son, Jacob. But by the mid-1990s, her relationship with her husband began to deteriorate. Paul began drinking, and Margaret, tired of the arguments, filed for divorce in 1998. The court left the children with her, but Paul paid child support irregularly, which forced Margaret to look for work. She moved to Liberty, where life was cheaper, and got a job at a clinic. The divorce left its mark on Margaret. Friends noticed that she avoided long-term relationships, preferring short romances. In the 2000s, she had several relationships, but none developed into anything serious. In 2012, Margaret dated a car repair shop owner from a neighboring town, but the relationship ended when he accused her of being too demanding. This episode became the subject of gossip in Liberty, but Margaret quickly restored her reputation by actively participating in charity events. By 2018, Margaret seemed content with her life. The children were grown, Emily worked in Chicago, Jacob served in the army. Margaret lived alone in a small apartment and enjoyed her independence. Her romance with Daniel Crowe came as a surprise to her friends. They thought Margaret would choose someone more outgoing, but she said Daniel gave her a sense of stability. However, her friends noticed that Margaret sometimes seemed worried. She mentioned that Daniel did not always answer her calls and could disappear for a day without explanation. At the clinic, Margaret's colleagues noticed that she was checking her phone more often while working. One day, she received a text message, after which she quickly went into the back room. Later, a colleague saw Margaret writing something in a notebook, but did not share the contents. During the same period, Margaret began borrowing small amounts of money from a friend, explaining it as unforeseen expenses. The friend did not pay any attention to this, but later the police became interested in these transactions. Margaret's life, despite its outward openness, held its secrets. Her phone contained correspondence with an unknown number, in which money and old affairs were mentioned. These details only emerged after the tragedy, when the police began to look into her past. By early 2019, Daniel Crowe and Margaret Lindsay's seemingly stable romance was beginning to show signs of trouble. Liberty residents, accustomed to seeing them together, began to notice that the couple was appearing less in public. Margaret, usually lively and outgoing, seemed tired, and Daniel was becoming even more withdrawn. Those who knew them began to suspect that something was wrong in their relationship, but no one could quite put their finger on it. In January 2019, Margaret told a friend that she and Daniel were arguing frequently. The reason, she said, was his reluctance to discuss the future. Margaret wanted them to move in together and even offered to sell their apartment to buy a house together. However, Daniel avoided these conversations every time. He said he was not ready for such steps and asked for time. Margaret, who was used to getting her way, began to put pressure on him, which only increased the tension. At the plant, Daniel's co-workers noticed changes in his behavior. He became irritable, sometimes losing his temper over trivial matters. One worker recalled Daniel dropping a tool and swearing at length, something no one had noticed him do before. His boss also noted that Daniel began skipping shifts, citing personal circumstances. At the same time, he continued to take overtime, as if trying to make as much money as possible. This raised questions, but no one dared to ask directly. Margaret also began to behave unusually. At the clinic, she became more distracted and made mistakes in scheduling patients. Her colleagues noticed that she often went outside to talk on the phone. One of these calls ended with Margaret returning to the office with red eyes. She explained it was an allergy, but her colleagues suspected something else. During the same period, Margaret asked another friend to lend her $500, promising to return it in a month. The friend agreed, but the money was never returned. Margaret's neighbors said they could sometimes hear loud conversations in her apartment. One day in February 2019, a neighbor saw Daniel quickly walk out of the front door, get into his pickup truck, and drive away. Margaret showed up at the door a few minutes later, holding her phone and looking upset. The neighbor didn't intervene, but later recalled that Margaret looked like she was holding back tears. By March 2019, the couple's relationship had reached a breaking point. Margaret stopped mentioning Daniel to her friends, and he no longer picked her up after work. But they continued to see each other, and phone records show they were exchanging dozens of text messages daily. The messages, later examined by police, included both loving messages and mutual accusations. April 15, 2019, began as a typical spring day in Liberty, Missouri. Temperatures were in the 70s, and residents were enjoying the warmth after a long winter. Margaret Lindsay reported for work at her dental office at 8 a.m. as usual. She wore a light blue blouse and black pants, and her co-workers noted that she seemed a little distracted, but she carried out her duties without complaint. Margaret finished work at 4 p.m. that day, and, according to a co-worker, she mentioned that she was going to meet someone that evening. Daniel Crow had been working at the plant since the morning that day. His shift ended at 3:30 p.m., after which he went into the locker room, changed clothes, and left in his pickup truck. Co-workers recalled that he was quiet, but this did not arouse suspicion, since Daniel was rarely talkative. CCTV cameras at the plant recorded him leaving the parking lot at 3:45 p.m. At 6:30 p.m., Margaret was seen at a local supermarket, where she bought a bottle of wine, cheese, and bread. A cashier who knew her noted that she seemed calm and even joked about the weather. Margaret then returned to her apartment on Main Street. Neighbors confirmed seeing her car parked outside her building at around 7 p.m. That same evening, around 8 p.m., Daniel's pickup truck was seen on the street near Margaret's apartment. A neighbor walking his dog saw Daniel enter the building. What happened in Margaret's apartment in the following hours remained unknown until the investigation began. At 11:17 p.m., a 911 dispatcher received a call from a neighbor who reported a loud noise, similar to screaming, coming from Margaret's apartment. Police arrived at the scene at 11:25 p.m. The apartment door was ajar, and officers found Margaret Lindsay on the living room floor. She was dead. The cause of death, the coroner later determined, was a stab wound to the chest. At the crime scene, police found a kitchen knife, a bottle of wine, 2 glasses, and traces of blood on the floor and walls. Daniel Crow was not in the apartment. His pickup truck was also missing from the street, but cameras at a gas station 10 miles outside Liberty captured the car at 10:50 p.m. Daniel was filling up the tank and, according to the cashier, seemed calm. Police issued a search warrant for him that night, but his whereabouts remained unknown until the morning. Fingerprints, DNA samples, and other evidence were collected at the crime scene, which later became key to the case. On the morning of April 16, 2019, Liberty Police began investigating the murder of Margaret Lindsay. Detective Robert Hayes, a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience, led the case. Margaret's apartment was cordoned off and forensic scientists began collecting evidence. Daniel Crow's fingerprints were found on a knife found at the crime scene, and DNA testing confirmed his blood on the handle. This led police to consider Daniel as the prime suspect. At 6:30 a.m., his pickup truck was found parked at an abandoned warehouse 15 miles outside of town. Daniel was inside the vehicle and offered no resistance when arrested. During his initial interrogation, Daniel claimed to have been at Margaret's flat on the evening of April 15th, but to have left at around 10 p.m. after an argument. He claimed that Margaret was alive when he left and denied involvement in the murder. However, his clothes, seized during his arrest, contained traces of blood, which were later matched to Margaret's DNA. Daniel was unable to explain their origin, claiming he had no recollection of the evening. Police also found that he had tried to wipe the blood off his hands with petrol, which was confirmed by chemical analysis. Detectives reviewed both men's phone records. Text messages between Daniel and Margaret in recent weeks showed that their relationship was strained. In one text, Margaret wrote, "You need to tell me what's going on or I'll figure it out." Daniel was evasive. Police also found calls from Daniel to a Kansas City number belonging to Michael Thorne, a man with a previous conviction for fraud. Thorne was interviewed but said he had no direct contact with Daniel and did not know Margaret. In Margaret's flat, police found a notebook with notes on amounts of money and dates, some of which matched the period when she had borrowed from friends. One entry read, DK, 2000, pay back by May. This raised suspicions that Daniel might be connected to Margaret's financial problems. However, neither of their bank accounts showed any large transactions, and this line of inquiry was abandoned. Margaret's neighbors and co-workers were interviewed. They confirmed that she had appeared distressed in recent months, but no one knew of any specific threats. Daniel's co-workers at the plant reported that he had been acting strangely, often talking on the phone in private. One worker recalled Daniel mentioning that he was tired of problems, but did not elaborate. By late April, police had gathered enough evidence to charge Daniel with first-degree murder. His attorney insisted it was a random encounter, but the evidence, including fingerprints and DNA, was overwhelming. The investigation continued to determine a motive. The murder of Margaret Lindsay left a deep mark on Liberty. A town accustomed to a quiet life was confronted with a harsh reality. The case showed how personal relationships can lead to tragedy. Margaret, energetic and open, was looking for stability, but her relationship with Daniel proved fatal. Daniel, withdrawn and secretive, never revealed the motives for his actions. The investigation revealed financial issues and secret calls, but there was no complete clarity. The trial became a lesson for residents. Even in a quiet town, no one is immune from danger. Margaret's children continue to cherish the memory of their mother, and Liberty gradually returned to normal life, but the story of this murder remains in the memory as a reminder of the fragility of human connections.